Second presenter, Professor Edward Yencken is a PhD candidate in the School of Social and Political Science at the University of Melbourne. And he's going to present on, from the CAP to the European crisis, to what extent do bilateral disputes still negatively influence the EU-Australia relationship?
Okay, thank you first of all to Philip Murray and to Lachlan Mckenzie for organising this event. It's a great opportunity to discuss many of these issues which often get pushed to the side at a number of larger conferences, and just to have it all in one place at one time is a great opportunity. Just a brief outline of my presentation. It will be based on two case studies of my thesis, the Common Agricultural Policy and the Eurozone Crisis. I perhaps might focus more on the Eurozone Crisis as a result of previous speakers discussing the CAP in some detail, or at least going through some of the issues already. But what I basically will argue, based on two sets of interviews that I've done, or the first of two sets of interviews that I've done, is that Australia has historically focused on bilateral disputes such as the CAP at the expense of establishing a more broad-based and constructive relationship. However, more recently, over the past sort of 10 to 20 years, an identification of common norms and values has contributed to a belief that Australia's interests are best served by seeking a more broad-based relationship with the EU instead of focusing on the CAP and the Eurozone crisis. So the CAP is the basis for conflict implemented in 1962, and we have the Menzies government campaigning strongly against it, particularly based on the likely accession to the EU, even though it didn't happen until 1973 and the repercussions of that event taking place. However, by the late 70s, some of the fears associated with the CAP were beginning to come to reality, I suppose, to at least some extent, as Monnet has noted. But I suppose on the other side, it is important to note that Australia did concurrently have significant expansion of trade with countries in the Asia-Pacific region, such as Japan. However, we did have former Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser describing the CAP as a protectionist monster, and I suppose this did reflect the fears at the time. And by the end of the 70s, particularly with this sort of high-level criticism, we did see the CAP becoming an all-encompassing issue in the bilateral relationship. And that's just briefly a rundown of the decrease in trade to the EC9 as it then was. And obviously you can see that some of the decreases came before the UK's accession to the EU, but it's still notable the amount of the decrease that did take place. But the persistence of the CAP through the 80s is also a notable feature, particularly as Brown says here, as long as the CAP exists, or in its form then, there will be difficulties between Australia and the EU. And I suppose now, based on the interviews that I've done, this fact has now been recognised, that the Commission official did say that these were grounded in substance based on the EU being very protectionist in the 60s, 70s and 80s, with Australia being rightly against it. But the impact of Australian criticism, as Ward said in 2002, it did distract from the broad bilateral relationship and the sense of cooperation, being able to expand beyond single issues. Also the concept of collective amnesia by Groom, that Australia was becoming ignorant of particularly important developments taking place in the EU, EC, such as the single market, and also the fact that by the early 90s the EU had become Australia's largest trading partner. And that's just, I suppose, a cartoon from Nicholson and the Australian, kind of reflecting some of the traditional Australian perceptions of the CAP. But the reforms of the CAP, I suppose, are one element of the CAP becoming less of an irritant in the relationship. I won't go through them all there, but Australia's perceptions as a result of these reforms began to change. And the reforms, not only in terms of their impact on Australia, but generally presenting the EU in a more positive light in multilateral discussions. And particularly, a DG Trade official said there that there's a recognition now from Australia, or particularly over the last 10 to 20 years, that the EU has shifted a long way in reducing the amount spent on the CAP and agricultural subsidies, but there's still perhaps some way to go. And then that's just a graphical, I suppose, representation of the decrease as a percentage, but then again, the overall spending has remained relatively stable. But I'll just press on. Multilateralising or bypassing the CAP, we have seen a moving of discussions to the WTO level and a sense of separating the CAP from the rest of the relationship, and a shared view, and this is reflected by my interviews with both EU and Australian officials, that this is the right place to discuss the issue. And more generally, and this is a particularly important thing now, that the extent to which Australia and the EU share many common views on trade and trade policy in the WTO, and particularly on the Doha round. And the changing perceptions. So we see the evolution of the Australian approach, the recognition of common interests in trade and other policy sectors, and particularly a recognition more of changing Australian perceptions of the value of the relationship with the EU, of what was actually going on despite this focus on agriculture. And that's, I suppose, reflected in this quote from a DG Agriculture official by the decrease of the amount of time the Australian ambassador at the time was spending on discussing the CAP with EU officials. So the future of the CAP, I suppose, it still is an irritant. Whether there is a potential FTA, there's no FTA in the current framework agreement negotiations, but if there was in the future, whether that could be an irritant. But however, there is this idea that agriculture could become more of a facilitator in the future. But generally, I suppose the point I'm trying to make about the CAP is that the state of the bilateral relationship is broad-based enough that it no longer significantly dominates the relationship like it used to. I'll just go through this pretty quickly, but just the improvement of political relations under the Howard government, this is between the CAP and the Eurozone crisis, the emphasis on common values and interests, the increased number of high-level Australian visits, and an EU EEAS official particularly noted the closeness of the Downer and the Patton relationship. So I suppose a lot of things going on behind the scenes, despite perhaps John Howard's criticism in particular of the CAP and some aspects of the EU in that sense. And also Brendan Nelson's, his effectiveness as the ambassador to in the mission was particularly noted. But the Eurozone crisis, just moving on to my second case study now. Early Australian governments believed essentially that this was connected with the global financial crisis, so not necessarily an issue by itself, no specific country or region blamed by the Australian government, and several EU officials, when I talked to them about the crisis, did see it in the context of broader global instability as opposed to an issue in itself. But Australian criticism emerges, and this has been particularly seen by Wayne Swan, the Treasurer, and Julia Gillard as the Prime Minister. This quote here, and the Council official noting that it has become a bit of an irritant, that perhaps they're a bit sick of this criticism, and that was reflected in Commission President Barroso's statement there, which while it wasn't specifically directed at Australia, was a criticism in general of external countries criticising the EU, and that's just a nice cartoon from the Australian. But the negative influence of the Australian media, and this has already been brought up, widely observed as a problem amongst officials, EU and Australian officials, particularly EU officials, contributing to negative perceptions of the EU and the importance of the bilateral relationship. But in particular, this sense of inaccurate press coverage by Australia has been an issue, and this is, I suppose, particularly been linked maybe with the Australian and a number of journalists in the Australian, perhaps more so than Fairfax, but given that the Australian, or the News Limited has 70% of media coverage, of newspapers in Australia, their voice, I suppose, is being disproportionately heard. Just moving on. So the need for public perceptions to be addressed, and the need for the Australian mission, I suppose, in Brussels to try and change this perception has been particularly noted by a number of EU officials. The extent to which this is possible, and I'm now aware obviously that there are Australian journalists on the ground in Brussels, but there's obviously still a perception out there that there aren't Australians, and perhaps particularly News Limited, Fairfax journalists not in Brussels. But the impact of this criticism, whether I suppose it's just being isolated to the political level, or whether it's having an impact on the ground, is something that is slightly subjective. But I suppose in the future, should this criticism continue, this was noted by an EEAS official at the bottom of the page, whether this criticism continues, there is a sense that it perhaps could have a greater impact on the relationship should the high-level Australian politicians continue to, in a sense, I suppose, lecture the EU on their handling of the crisis. This is also something, is that 10? Oh, sorry. Yeah. So Australia in the Asia Pacific and the EU, the sense that they might be both becoming internally focused, and the potential for ignoring each other. I mean, an MEP said to me that this was quite natural, quite normal, but I suppose there also is a sense, though, that we, both Australia and the EU, can balance these issues, but with the lack of financial resources, particularly with the EU, whether that's necessarily going to be possible, is perhaps something to think about, but something that particularly officials weren't necessarily thinking was going to happen. But the recognition of the impact, particularly the council official noted that the Australian mission is very much aware of what the papers are saying, what the negative Australian perception of the EU and the need to change that. And Brendan Nelson, I think, noted that in an article in The Australian a few years ago. But the crisis has, I suppose, not detracted from the bilateral relationship. This is noted by an Australian official, and particularly they wanted to emphasise cooperation at the G20 level. And yeah, so generally speaking, the divergence between official cooperation and political or high-level political cooperation and rhetoric has perhaps been noted. The extent, I suppose, now, or what I'm looking at particularly in this discussion as well as in my thesis, is whether it's a durable bilateral relationship, to mean that Australia and the EU can disagree on certain issues now, and it won't necessarily define the entire tone of relations, and whether they can now move beyond as opposed to the past. But in the sense that it hasn't really had much of an overall impact on relations. And also an interesting and notable point at the bottom there is a DFAT or Australian official made, whether the Eurozone crisis could in fact increase cooperation between the EU and Australia if the EU has less of an ability to push or needs further cooperation, particularly in the Asia Pacific region, whether that's something that might happen in the future. So beyond, I suppose, bilateral disputes, is continuing with this same theme, that the cap will always receive attention as it consumes too much of the EU budget. There always will be some level of criticism, I suppose it's important to acknowledge that. But the extent now, and including that with the Eurozone crisis, that cooperation in almost all areas, even trade and agricultural policy, is happening. It's happening. It's not just we're no longer focused on one issue of consternation, and likely, hopefully, to be reflected in the depth and the breadth of the framework agreement when it's finalised. But it's interesting, just as a side note, as I said there, one official was saying that because it doesn't have a free trade agreement, whether the actual significance of the agreement was brought somewhat into question. Just this concept, I suppose, finally, of shared interests between the EU and Australia. We are a natural ally with Australia. We are on the same side in Australia in almost all trade discussions. And I suppose you can even extrapolate more broadly the extent to which the EU and Australia share so many similar values and interests. You can have, from time to time, hiccups or small issues, but this sense that the Australian file, particularly amongst EU officials, is perceived as relaxing and not necessarily without larger irritants is a particularly common feature in the interviews that I did. And common norms and values at the basis of a relationship, and this is something that's once again was reflected in my interviews both with EU and Australian officials. Just finally with this quote here, I used to say to my Australian colleagues, if you were not on the other side of the world, you could easily be an EU member state because of cultural language, outlook on the economy, human rights issues, etc. So I suppose that basically summarises the extent to which the EU and Australia do share so many common values, so many common interests, irrespective of, I suppose, of these bilateral disputes that I've discussed, and the sense that the relationship has now matured significantly, that these issues can no longer negatively impact the relationship to a large extent. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Exactly 15 minutes. Excellent. Okay, third speaker. Mr. Lachlan Mckenzie, also a PhD candidate in the School of Social and Political Science at the University of Melbourne, who is presenting on negotiating EU-Australian engagement, the 1994 and 2008 wine trade agreements. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. So yeah, I'll be speaking about the 1994 and 2008 wine trade agreements, which I think are significant in, or have been significant in, the changing character of Australia's engagement with the EU. They stand out, I think, as one of the few trade agreements in primary products which has been successfully negotiated between the EU and Australia. Today I'll be focusing on the process of these negotiations. I'll be drawing out some lessons for the wider relationship. I'll be drawing on information which I conducted in interviews in 2011 with Australian negotiators of the agreement, in-depth interviews. I'll also be basing the speech off some document analysis, and I'll be suggesting that in spite of some significant structural asymmetries between the two parties, a win-win outcome was achieved for Australia, where in fact Australia fared very well in terms of long-term economic outcomes. I suggest that there are two primary factors which shape this win-win outcome which favoured Australia. Firstly, the domestic factors which brought the EU to the negotiating table. These were primarily demands from wine industry, particularly French wine industry, for the protection of their geographical indicators, such as champagne or GIs, as well as traditional expressions. And I suggest that these domestic factors were significant in shaping the EU's bargaining leverage. Secondly, both the EU and Australia's respective relationship with their wine industries was significant in shaping their bargaining behaviour. And I suggest that these two factors are what shaped outcomes in the relationship, in the agreement, sorry. So the European wine industry has always been a global leader. Excluding wine trade between member states, the EU's share of global wine exports in the early 1990s was 58%, which is massive dominance. In contrast, in the early 1990s, the Australian industry was very much domestically focused and had been suffering extremely slow growth since the 1980s. Not only is the EU's wine industry significant in economic terms, it's also of massive cultural importance to many member states, particularly France. Adding to this cultural significance, European wine industries are well coordinated, very well funded, and therefore able to exercise significant lobbying clout in Brussels. This gave the EU a strong political incentive to enter negotiations. The French industry and the Champagne Wine Industry Associations in particular, by nature of its size, economic value and cultural significance, were very vocal stakeholders in this process of bringing the EU to the negotiating table. So why they had to get there? The French wine industry had been attempting to protect the use of its GIs in Australia through domestic Australian legal mechanisms prior to the agreement. They had had no success because Australia had been using GIs such as champagne in the naming and labelling of its wine since the infancy of the industry in the 1800s, and this predated French official regulation and use of wine names. Therefore, they didn't have any solid intellectual property claims as far as the Australian legal system was concerned. With this lack of domestic legal resources, European wine industries were forced to basically enter into a negotiated agreement with the Australian government where there would have to be an incentive for Australian compliance. The protection of European wine GIs and PEs was the central objective of the EU. However, there was also a desire to establish a precedent, a template negotiation, which could be used in other similar agreements with other New World wine producers. In response to this EU mandate, Australia negotiated a bargain for better access to the EU's wine market. An Australian negotiator who I interviewed described the European position as one where the French were so offended with us using champagne and the denigration of their brand that it would have overcome any reservations they would have had. On top of this, if an agreement were not reached, failure to reach an agreement would have significantly damaged the EU's prospects of using this as a template which they could export to negotiate other similar agreements with other New World producers. These contextual factors are, I suggest, unique in EU-Australian negotiating encounters and allowed for successful bargaining, concession making, and overall successful negotiation outcomes. As it's been well established that the complexity of EU policy processes and treaty ratification processes make it a particularly hard bargainer in international trade and commercial negotiations. This is a dynamic that's been explored by Sophie Monnet in her book Trading Voices, as well as some other scholars. And Australian negotiators certainly felt the effects of this complicated policy process during the negotiation of the wine trade agreements. This one Australian negotiator reflected the Europeans were the slow ones to come to the table because they had 16 people, or member states, that they had to get to the table. Another Australian negotiator described the negotiations as pedantic. We couldn't get anything through. The negotiations were very difficult. In the case of the wine trade agreements, the EU's unique relationship to its wine industry diminished this notorious capacity for inflexibility. The European wine industry is heavily regulated by government, and in the French example, the government regulates which grapes can be grown where, methods of production, as well as